the spice must flow. It's a quote Dune fans know well, second perhaps only to
"He who controls the spice controls the universe."
Although most fans will be surprised to learn that neither of those quotes are found in Frank Herbert's original books. The popular lines come from David Lynch's 1984 film, which shows us how deeply that first movie added to the Dune experience. A movie that was made before its time, as Hollywood technology had not yet progressed to a place where it could really show us the universe Herbert had created in his 1965 novel. Legendary science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001 and 2010 among others, once sent a letter to Herbert's editor comparing Dune to The Lord of the Rings because of the extraordinary detail that the world creates. As it would turn out, it was The Lord of the Rings that would have fans and studio executives chanting for the spice to flow. This chant would eventually culminate into the successful 2021 and 2024 two-part sweeping theatrical epic by Denis Villeneuve.
You must build as much as possible because it will influence acting, it will influence the imagination of the actors, it will influence myself.
The nearly 60-year journey to properly recreate one of the greatest science fiction franchises on the big screen finally happened. And while we strongly believe these movies aren't the last we'll see of the Dune universe, we have questions. Where did the inspiration for Dune come from? What happened to the movie that was never made? Why did David Lynch hate his movie, and why did it take nearly 2 decades for Hollywood to finally make a version true to the vision? Well, all of these questions and more are about to be answered. This is the definitive history of Dune. And you've never heard it told like this before. And if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please do so now. And give us a thumbs up if you want more videos like this. And make sure you stay tuned to the end to see how to get this awesome Dune-inspired graphic design only at mixtease.com. The truth about Dune is that it was almost never published as a novel, and the man who risked everything to make it happen would ultimately be punished for his effort. But let's get back to that in a moment. First, in 1957, the space age began with the USSR launching the first artificial satellite Sputnik 1, propelling humanity in a race for the stars. That same year, 37-year-old Frank Herbert took a small plane to Florence, Oregon to write an article about sand dunes. In a pitch to his editor, he titled it, "They Stopped the Moving Sands." The U.S. Department of Agriculture had discovered a successful method of stabilizing sand dunes by planting poverty grasses at the highest point of the dune to keep them from encroaching on roads and buildings. It's obvious from the letters Herbert sent his editor that he was fascinated with the effects wind-driven sand dunes had in the Sahara and other places, swallowing cities and towns throughout time. But while Herbert was intoxicated to tell this story, his editor made it very clear he was the only one. While Herbert would eventually lose interest in writing the article, he realized it was putting him on a path of something much bigger.
And then when it happened big, and I was very surprised by how big it came along.
And with Sputnik circling the globe, and Frank Herbert being inspired to write one of the best science fiction novels of all time, also in 1957, a child was born in Frankfurt, West Germany. That child would become a huge fan of Dune as a teenager.
Absolutely. As a teenager, it was one of my favorite books. It was one of the most important books.
And in 2022, Hans Zimmer, who had scored over 150 films, would win only his second Oscar for Best Original Score on Denis Villeneuve's Dune.
And the Oscar goes to Hans Zimmer.
Hans Zimmer cannot be here tonight. We accept on his behalf.
But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Dune and the Dune saga may be science fiction, but like his great worms, Frank Herbert was tunneling for something deeper. Influenced by great thinkers like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, Dune is a complex story about the future of humanity involving philosophy, religion, psychology, politics, and ecology through the lens of a 20th century perspective. Herbert was fascinated with the impact of human effort on the world around us, not just our impact on the environment, but in the ways our interactions affect the world around us. Whether it be with cultures, religion, politics, and charismatic leaders.
Their mistakes are amplified by the numbers who follow them without question.
He was also genuinely concerned and curious about what the actions of humans on Earth would mean for the eventual future of humanity.
Dune is conceived of as a planet that is totally desert. so that water on it is the metaphor of, say, oil here. It is a metaphor of clean air, a metaphor of water. It's a metaphor for the shortages that we are encountering because of overpopulation.
Herbert drew further inspiration from Native American men like Howard Hansen. Hansen grew up on the Quileute Reservation near Herbert's hometown and regularly shared his writing with the author. Hansen told Herbert in 1958 that white men are eating the earth after sharing the effects of logging on his reservation. He said they are going to turn this whole planet into a wasteland, just like North Africa. The world could become a big dune, Herbert responded. Herbert had written his first novel only 2 years earlier. Titled The Dragon and the Seas, it was about a near-future Earth where the West and the East had been at war for more than a decade, with the West stealing oil from the East with specialized nuclear submarines.
Water on it is the metaphor of, say, oil here. Very appropriate at the moment.
It's obvious that oil was on Herbert's mind. Only 20 years before Herbert began working on Dune, an American-owned oil well in Saudi Arabia drilled into what would become the largest source of petroleum in the world. It's obvious that stories like this inspired Herbert's Dune, and the relationship with local desert dwellers who might be displaced by the West's newfound riches was always on his mind. Throw in a mind-altering drug that also doubles as the only substance to allow interstellar travel, and you have everything you need for a high-stakes space drama. While Herbert never publicly discussed the use of drugs as his inspiration for Dune, according to legendary mycologist Paul Stamets, in an article with the Daily Grail, Herbert confided in Stamets that Dune took inspiration from his own experiences with magic mushrooms.
20 grams of mushrooms, hug at a tree, the lightning comes, it hits you, and I go, whoa. I saw fractals for the first time.
Stamets said Frank told him that much of the premise of Dune, the magic spice that allowed the bending of space, the giant worms, the blue eyes of the Fremen, the mysticism of the Bene Gesserit, came from his perception of the fungal life cycle, and his imagination was stimulated through his experiences with the use of magic mushrooms. According to Stamets, Herbert shared his technique with him for using spores when he met him in the early 80s. Frank enjoyed collecting mushrooms on his property near Port Townsend, Washington. Herbert's use of drugs in the story would follow the logic of the desert, their communities, and the spiritual drugs and journeys of those people. Herbert had considered using Mars as a setting for the novel, but eventually decided to use a fictional planet instead, thinking readers would have too many preconceived ideas about that planet because of all the stories already written about it. Over the next several years of researching and writing, Herbert had plotted a short adventure novel he called Spice Planet, but set the outline aside when he realized his concept was growing into something much more ambitious. In early 1963, Herbert finally presented a draft of Dune to his editor. The story, set on the desert planet Arrakis, Dune is the story of the boy Paul Atreides, heir to a noble family tasked with ruling an inhospitable world where the only thing of value is the spice melange, a drug capable of extending life and enhancing consciousness. The editor's response was that he thought Frank had done a fantastic job and he really had something. His editor began immediately reaching out to magazines. For many writers at this time, getting a novel published was wonderful, but getting your stories published in a magazine is what paid the bills. And one of the best in the 1960s was Analog Magazine, who was busy producing thinking men's science fiction at that time. Dune World would end up running in 3 parts from December 1963 to February 1964 for $2,550 or $25,000 in today's money. It was a huge success for Herbert. While Analog was publishing the serialization monthly, Herbert's editor had been reaching out to major publishers for the novel at the same time. The response to the story itself after the first 100 pages was fantastic, but there was one huge problem. The book was too long. Typical science fiction novels of the time were published with between 50 and 75,000 words. But Dune? Well, Dune was approaching 200,000 words. Doubleday, Scribner's, and nearly 20 other publishing companies said no. Herbert felt strongly that Dune would be a moneymaker for whoever published it. It was in early 1965 when Frank Herbert received good news from a surprising source. Chilton Books, known for publishing auto repair manuals, made an offer for $7,500 plus future royalties to publish the whole thing in a single hardcover book. Chilton's editor, Sterling Lanier, had read the story in Analog magazine and vouched for the novel with his company. The cost to get you a hardback Dune book in October 1965? $5.95, or just over $60 today. It was not cheap. Remember earlier when we told you the truth about Dune is that it might never have been published had it not been for a man who risked everything to make it? That was Sterling Lanier. And after 5 months of disappointing sales on the new novel, Lanier was fired. It was the same month Dune won the Hugo Award. It would take another year for word of mouth about this new exciting science fiction monster novel to get around, and sales began to pick up. Suddenly, stores couldn't keep Dune in stock. Today, Herbert's Dune has sold over 20 million copies and is considered one of the greatest science fiction stories ever told.
I am Will Wheaton. Dune is an absolute contender for your favorite book.
One would hope someone sent Sterling Lanier a big check at some point. But not everyone loved Dune. J.R.R. Tolkien, whose Lord of the Rings Dune had been compared to, refused to review Dune because, quote, he disliked it with some intensity, unquote. He felt it would be unfair to Herbert if he gave an honest review of the book. While no specifics are given on why Tolkien didn't like the work, and this is 100% conjecture, but there are serious anti-colonialism themes in Dune, and Tolkien's British Empire was still working on granting independence to countries at that time. It's just a guess, but we'll likely never know for sure. After Dune became a critical and financial success for Herbert, he was able to devote himself to writing full-time. He would write the sequel Dune Messiah in 1969, followed by Children of Dune in 1976, God Empire of Dune in 1981, Heretics of Dune in 1984, and finally Chapter House Dune in 1985. Herbert passed away a short time later on February 11, 1986, from a massive pulmonary embolism while recovering from surgery for pancreatic cancer. He was 66. The Dune novels wouldn't end with Frank Herbert. His son Brian would go on to write 14 more Dune books from 1999 to 2016. The incredible success of the Dune novel meant it was only a matter of time before Hollywood would come knocking. 1968 had 2 fantastic science fiction movies that would give the studios confidence to make Dune for the right price. The movies were Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes starring Charlton Heston. So in 1971, the production company Apjack International, who was busy making the Planet of the Apes movies, optioned the right to make Dune. After a delay because of Planet of the Apes sequels, shooting was finally scheduled to begin in 1974, but the head of the production company died. Late in 1974, a French consortium bought the rights from Apjack with plans to let Alejandro Jodorowsky direct.
I was raping Frank Herbert, raping like this, but with love.
Jodorowsky was the godfather of the cult midnight movie and known for his daring and psychedelic films of the early 1970s. But Jodorowsky wasn't just making a film about the Spice Planet. He wanted to create a profit, and his goal was to change the world. Jodorowsky assembled a team of spiritual warriors, assembling some of the most talented visual artists of the era. Pink Floyd was doing the soundtrack, and his cast would include Orson Welles, Mick Jagger, David Carradine, and even Salvador Dali. He and his team spent 2 years creating a Dune Bible with over 3,000 storyboard pages, numerous paintings, and incredible costumes with an outrageous, moving, and powerful screenplay. But when Jodorowsky started meeting with studio executives, there was only one problem. The movie was too big, or perhaps they were afraid to let Jodorowsky explore his vision. Regardless, the financial backing dried up, and Jodorowsky's Dune would not get made. But whether mad or a genius, the one thing you can say about Jodorowsky's Dune is that without the talent he assembled to make the movie, it's likely the Alien franchise would have never happened. Dan O'Bannon, who had been all in with Dune and was devastated when it didn't happen, went to work on an old script he had been working on before Dune. Because of his relationship with the team on Dune, he would bring in many of the team members that were also working on Dune. The movie would become Alien. In 1976, Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis, who had just produced King Kong, purchased the rights for Dune, and in 1978 commissioned Herbert to write a new screenplay. The script was 175 pages long, which would amount to a 3-hour movie. As fate would have it, De Laurentiis hired Ridley Scott to direct, who was hot off of Alien, which of course partially owed its existence to the earlier unmade Dune movie. But after 7 months, as a new first draft script was written, Scott dropped out of Dune. Ridley thought the movie would need another 2.5 years of work, and with his older brother recently dying from cancer, he needed something more fast-paced to get his mind off of the tragedy. And while that may be true, there was more to the story. In 2021, Ridley revealed that after taking a trip to see where the movie was going to be filmed in Mexico, and the austere conditions he would have to deal with, he told De Laurentiis he couldn't do it. Scott would end up going back to the movie he passed on just before taking Dune, Blade Runner. It was suddenly 1981 and no Dune yet. The 9-year film rights De Laurentiis had was about to expire. Hot off of Flash Gordon, De Laurentiis renegotiated the rights and managed to include all Dune sequels, even those unwritten. The Elephant Man had come out the previous year, and De Laurentiis' daughter, Rafaela, thought its director, David Lynch, should make Dune. Lynch was quickly gaining popularity after making Eraserhead, and now an Academy Award Best Director for The Elephant Man, and was receiving several other offers, including directing Star Wars Return of the Jedi. He passed on Star Wars, not feeling like he'd have enough control over the movie. He wasn't really a science fiction fan and admitted to not really liking Star Wars. So it's no surprise that when De Laurentiis asked him to direct Dune, Lynch said, "June? No, it's Dune." Lynch had never heard of it. But he read the novel and was so excited, the same day he finished it, he met with De Laurentiis in his office and signed on. When I finished the novel, I was just knocked out. I'd seen Star Wars, of course, but to be honest, I wasn't all that crazy about it. For me, there was just too much on the surface of that film and nothing else. Dune was different. It had believable characterizations and depth. In many ways, Herbert had created an internal adventure, one with a lot of emotion and physical textures, and I love textures. Lynch worked on the script, initially planning to turn the story into 2 films, but it was eventually condensed into 1. The talk behind the scenes was that there would eventually be 3 films, as the producers thought they were making Star Wars for grown-ups. In early 1983, the production went to Mexico City to set up at Churubusco Studios and begin casting. The most important casting would be for the main character, Paul Atreides. Today, it's hard to imagine anyone but Kyle MacLachlan as Paul, but Val Kilmer was very nearly cast as the star of Dune. Kilmer, along with Tom Cruise, Kevin Costner, and others. According to David Lynch's Dune and Oral History, Cruise had difficulty with Herbert's language during the screen test. Ultimately, they felt like he was too young for the role, just coming off Risky Business. He was baby-faced, and they wanted someone a little more mature. Costner didn't have the inner strength they were looking for to play Paul Muad'Dib, and came across as nervous during the audition. The role was Kilmer's, although De Laurentiis didn't like the shape of his lips. And then MacLachlan read for the role straight out of a Seattle area theater. He hit it off with Lynch, and the director immediately liked him, feeling he had the inner strength that they were looking for to pull off Paul Muad'Dib. Other notable castings included Sean Young as Chani. Young was coming off a role opposite Harrison Ford in Blade Runner. Most people remember her as the main antagonist, Einhorn and Finkel, from Ace Ventura: Pet Detective.
She is suffering from the worst case of hemorrhoids.
Dean Stockwell had been a child actor in the 40s and had been bouncing around doing guest spots in TV shows for 30 years until he had to move his family to New Mexico to start selling real estate just to make ends meet. A huge fan of Dune, Stockwell found out the movie was being made in Mexico and decided to go down and try to get a role in the film. Lynch, who was thrown off by seeing the man, told Stockwell the cast was complete. But when John Hurt exited the project, the role of Dr. Wellington Yueh went to Stockwell. Lynch later told Stockwell that the reason he'd been looking at him so strangely is because he thought he had died. The role would end up reigniting Stockwell's career, eventually helping him land the role of Al in the Quantum Leap TV show.
Hi, cutie. You look great in powder blue.
Patrick Stewart, now the most famous person from the cast after his roles as Captain Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek and Professor X in the X-Men, was handpicked by Lynch to play Gurney Halleck after seeing him on stage performing as a long, gray-haired, cadaverous Henry IV. But when Stewart arrived in Mexico for filming, Lynch didn't recognize him. He thought he was hiring a haggard old man with hair instead of the 44-year-old virile Stewart. But at that point, Stewart was already a replacement for Aldo Ray, who left the film for health reasons. So, Stewart got the role. Actress Glenn Close nearly got the role as Jessica, Paul's mother, but they didn't feel like she was pretty enough. Close would go on to put a bullet in Robert Redford's character on The Natural, and the role of Jessica would go to Francesca Annis. Sting was cast as Fade Routha, but he didn't want to be in the film. He didn't think doing a big film was good for his career, but Lynch hopped on a plane and flew to London and convinced him to be in the movie. The best story from the set about Sting had to do with Patrick Stewart, who had no idea who the singer was. When he told Stewart he was in a band called The Police, Stewart said,
"Oh, what kind of band?" He said, "The Police." I said, "You play in a police band?"
Other notable cast members included Brad Dourif, Richard Jordan, Virginia Madsen, Max von Sydow, Kenneth McMillan, Linda Hunt, and Everett McGill. After 200 men spent 2 months crawling on their hands and knees over 3 square miles of the Semalayuca dune fields, clearing it of rattlesnakes, scorpions, and every inch of cactus, filming finally began March 30th, 1983. Dune was a huge production. It required 80 sets built on 16 sound stages and a crew of 1,700 people with over 20,000 extras. With a $40 million budget, De Laurentiis wanted to shoot in Mexico to take care of the favorable exchange rate, but you have to take the good with the bad. With telephones and power going out regularly, it was difficult to sew costumes, build props, or just use the Xerox machine. Access to facilities were also a problem. During the first month and a half of the shoot, 15% of the crew was in the hospital with varying illnesses. Eventually, the team would get into a rhythm working together to get the film done. Shooting would last for 6 months. Upon completion, the rough cut without post-production effects ran over 4 hours long. David Lynch's intended cut was almost 3 hours long. However, Universal Pictures and the movie's financiers expected a standard 2-hour cut of the movie. To reduce the runtime, De Laurentiis and Lynch edited numerous scenes, filmed new scenes that simplified or concentrated plot elements, and added voiceover narrations, plus a new introduction by Virginia Madsen. The movie would spend another 6 months in post-production and 9 months in editing. The film opened on December 14, 1984 in 915 theaters, earning over $6 million in its opening weekend and ranking number 2 at the box office behind Beverly Hills Cop. During the release, cheat sheets explaining much of the movie's setting and its more obscure vocabulary were handed out to moviegoers at some theaters. It's not a good sign if you have to explain the movie to people before they watch it. Dune would go on to earn nearly $31 million at the end of its run, but with a budget of $42 million, it was considered a box office disappointment. Dune was 34th at the box office in 1984, finishing behind Conan the Destroyer, Terminator, and 2010, among other movies. And a movie that was still making money in 1984 and was a colossal number 1 at the box office for 1983? Star Wars: Return of the Jedi, the movie David Lynch had turned down. To make matters worse, the reviews were not good. Roger Ebert gave Dune 1 star and wrote, "This movie is a real mess, an incomprehensible, ugly, unstructured, pointless excursion into the murkier realms of one of the most confusing screenplays of all time." He would later name it the worst movie of the year and said, quote, "If I haven't made myself clear, I hated watching this movie," unquote. Ouch. Because of the poor performance, all future sequels were canceled. Lynch had been working on a script for Dune Messiah, as he had been hired to also direct the second and third films. Over the years, the truth of what happened to Dune 1984 finally came out. In 2006, Lynch spoke candidly about his experience making the movie.
Dune, I didn't have final cut on. And it's the only film I've made that I didn't have. I didn't technically have final cut on The Elephant Man, but Mel Brooks gave it to me.
Lynch knew from the beginning that he wouldn't have the final decision on the movie and admitted he'd started selling out even in the script phase. For him, it was a slow, dying death and a terrible, terrible experience. To this day, he still doesn't know how it happened. He trusted that it would work out, but he admits to being very naive and made the wrong decision. In those days, the maximum number they figured I could have is 2 hours and 17 minutes, so they wouldn't lose a screening per day. So that's what the length of the film is. It was money talking, and it hurt. Patrick Stewart has said in interviews that every cast member lost 2 scenes to cuts made during the editing of Dune. According to Francesca Annis, who played Lady Jessica, De Laurentiis and David Lynch's different views, as well as De Laurentiis' creative interventions, contributed to the movie's poor performance. Lynch doesn't like talking about Dune, but he admitted that as soon as he signed away Final Cut, he started making a film that he thought De Laurentiis would accept instead of the movie he wanted to make. Looking back, he admits it's no one's fault but his own. He regrets making Dune, and has even insisted his name be taken off of some versions. And after years of saying there wasn't enough for a director's cut,
no, it doesn't exist.
During an article for Esquire in 2022, Lynch did say a director's cut could happen. We'll have to wait and see.
There's more stuff, but even that is putrefied.
As for Frank Herbert, what did he think about the movie version of his book? Well, he liked it. He thought it captured the book well. He said, of course, it leaves out scenes, but it would have to. Otherwise, we'd be here 14 hours. Everyone knew Dune would need more time on screen to tell the proper story. Following Lynch's Dune, the feeling that the book was unadaptable for the big screen became popular opinion, and any thoughts at giving it another try disappeared for more than a decade. Another popular book from a famous author was having the same problem. Stephen King had been trying to turn the 1,440-page book The Stand into a 2-hour movie since 1982. You can imagine the trouble when considering what Lynch had to go through condensing Dune's 896 pages into a 2-hour and 17-minute movie. Then in 1992, they found a solution for The Stand, a TV miniseries. Producer Richard Rubinstein, who had been working on the project for years, got it aired on ABC in May 1994. It won 6 Primetime Emmys and was so successful he made another Stephen King miniseries, The Langoliers, in 1995. Looking for more fantastic stories that could be told in this way, Rubinstein picked up the screen rights to the Dune novels the very next year. Now, he just needed the right vehicle to get it out to fans. As luck would have it, the Sci-Fi Channel, which had been operating since 1992, was in need of more and more original programming. Farscape had just started its 4-year run in 1999, and Rubinstein had brought in John Harrison to write and direct the Dune series once it got picked up. In November of that year, Harrison pitched 3 2-hour movies to air as a miniseries on the Young Network, and Sci-Fi gave the green light with a $20 million budget. After scouting desert locations around the world, Harrison made the decision to make the movie completely on sound stages in Prague, in the Czech Republic. Not only was it the most cost-effective place to shoot, but it also had the biggest sound stages in Europe, and this would give him the ability to create environments that can't be found on Earth. The miniseries, Frank Herbert's Dune, was released on December 3, 2000. Alec Newman was cast as Paul, but the biggest star in the series was William Hurt, who played Duke Leto Atreides. It was a dream part for the actor who had been a huge fan of Herbert's novels. Frank Herbert's Dune was a huge success for the Sci-Fi Channel, averaging 4.4 million viewers over the 3 nights it aired. It also won 2 Emmy Awards in 2001 for Outstanding Cinematography and Outstanding Visual Effects. Although the graphics don't stand up today, they are very complementary to the style TV shows were being made at the time. Sci-Fi's Dune kicked off a whole string of miniseries on the channel, including Frank Herbert's The Children of Dune, which covered Herbert's next 2 novels, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. Alec Newman was back as Paul, with Susan Sarandon, Alice Krige, and James McAvoy also starring. What both miniseries lacked in action, it made up for in staying true to the novels, which made Dune fans very happy at the time. Frank Herbert's Children of Dune won another Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Special Visual Effects and would eventually pave the way for Sci-Fi Channel's biggest miniseries, Battlestar Galactica. The story of Dune had finally been told completely and accurately. How long would it be before the visuals and the story could come together for a big-budget theatrical release? Dune has so many interesting connections with The Lord of the Rings. Arthur C. Clarke basically called it the Lord of the Rings of science fiction, and its author, J.R.R. Tolkien, couldn't stand the book and refused to review it. Then, in 2003, the 1,178 pages of The Lord of the Rings novels did something else for Dune. It got made properly by Peter Jackson, winning 17 Academy Awards out of 30 nominations. It was proof that Dune could finally be made in all its glory on the big screen. Following the Dune miniseries on Sci-Fi and the success of The Lord of the Rings, Dune was coming into a prime position to be made for theatrical release again. In August 2007, Byron Merritt, the grandson of Herbert, posted in an online forum that negotiations for a new Dune movie had been in the works for over 2 years, and they were very close to making a deal. Rubinstein, who still owned the rights following the miniseries, made a deal with Paramount Pictures. Paramount chose director Peter Berg to make the movie, as he had recently done The Kingdom, some of which had been filmed on location in Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. Berg left the project in 2009 to go work on Battleship. In March 2011, Paramount canceled the project, unable to come to terms with Rubinstein over an extension of rights. That same year, Mary Parent, who'd been an executive producer on The Kingdom, acquired the rights. And when she joined Legendary Entertainment in 2016, they acquired the rights in November that year. Director Denis Villeneuve had already expressed interest in the project earlier that year, saying it would be a long-standing dream of his to adapt Dune. Parent was impressed with his enthusiasm and hired him once he described his vision to her. It was February 2017, and neither Villeneuve nor Parent wanted to rush the project. He chose to complete the other 2 projects he had committed to first, with Arrival and Blade Runner 2049. That would give him time to co-write Dune himself. In March 2018, Villeneuve went to Parent and told her that he needed to make the movie in 2 parts. She agreed with him, and he secured a 2-movie deal with Warner Brothers Pictures, similar to the 2-part adaptation of Stephen King's It in 2017 and 2019. Considering the mistakes of the Lynch film being shortened and the success of longer movies being made in parts, it was an easy decision for the studio, although they officially held off on a green light for Part 2 until the first part had been released. By May 2018, a first draft of the script was done, covering the first half of the events of Dune. Villeneuve had seen Lynch's adaptation of the story, and while he respected the filmmaker in the film, he chose not to build on any of the elements from it. He wanted to go back to the book and look for the images that came out of what he read. He felt that his love for Dune would allow him to focus on his own vision, and he wanted to recreate the experience he had felt when he initially read the book as a teenager. With a script and a schedule in place, who would be in the movie? For Paul, Villeneuve wanted an actor who was an old soul in the body of a teenager. He wanted Timothée Chalamet in the role, and would later admit that he had no alternative choices in mind. Chalamet had previously auditioned for a role in Villeneuve's movie Prisoners back in 2013 and didn't get it. Chalamet traveled to the Cannes Film Festival to discuss the role with Villeneuve. Chalamet entered into final negotiations for the role in July 2018. In September, Rebecca Ferguson, who had been in the Mission Impossible movies, began talks to play Lady Jessica. Ferguson was initially dismissive of the role, feeling Lady Jessica was too similar to her previous roles and didn't want to be typecast as a strong female character. After seeing Villeneuve's vision and reading the novel, she completely fell in love with the character and signed on to play the role in January 2019. Guardians of the Galaxy muscle and comic relief Dave Bautista was offered the serious role of Glossu Raban following a phone call from the director. Villeneuve wanted Stellan Skarsgård to play Baron Vladimir Harkonnen because he found him intimidating. Skarsgård would end up spending 8 hours a day getting in his makeup for the role, which he admitted later gave him some anxiety. Villeneuve personally contacted Charlotte Rampling to play Gaius Helen. Rampling was previously eyed to play Lady Jessica in Jodorowsky's Dune. Once Oscar Isaac heard the film was in development, he contacted Villeneuve and told him he wanted to star in it. It would be 2 years before Villeneuve sent him a script and agreed to cast him as Duke Leto. As for Zendaya, she auditioned for the role of Chani alongside 5 other actresses. Not only did she have the best chemistry with Chalamet, but Villeneuve said Zendaya made him believe she had been raised on an alien planet. Jason Momoa was surprised when he got a call for the role of Duncan Idaho while he was snowboarding down a mountain. He later contacted Villeneuve and accepted the role, surprised he didn't have to audition. He'd always had to audition for all of his other roles. Josh Brolin wasn't selected by Villeneuve. Brolin had come into Legendary to pitch another project. Not only did they like the project he wanted to do, but they told him they just found their Gurney Halleck. Villeneuve called Javier Bardem directly and offered him the role of Stilgar. Bardem was shocked, because he had also wanted to portray Stilgar, comparing the role to his personal love for Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. Filming began on March 18, 2019 at Orijo Film Studios in Budapest, Hungary. Filming also took place in Wadi Rum, Jordan, which doubled for Arrakis. The Liwa Oasis in the United Arab Emirates also served as a key backdrop for Arrakis. Scenes featuring rock formations the Fremen use as heat shields were filmed in the Rub al Khali Desert in Abu Dhabi, and Planet Caladan was shot in Stanlandet, Norway. Filming wrapped on July 26, 2019. The movie had 1,200 VFX shots and with 18 tons of sand used on sets. It was mentioned earlier in this history, Hans Zimmer, who was born the same year Herbert came up with the idea for Dune, was the composer on the film. He spent a week in the Utah desert alone, capturing natural sounds to inspire his score. A huge fan of Dune, Zimmer passed on doing Tenet with Christopher Nolan so he could compose Dune. Dune was originally going to be released on November 20th, 2020, which was then pushed back to December 18th. The film was then delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic and planned for release October 1st, 2021. But to avoid competition with No Time to Die, they moved the film's American release to October 22nd. Over a month before being released in North America, the film had been released internationally. Just a week before the movie was being released, Warner Brothers announced Dune would be available to watch on HBO Max on October 21st. Already disappointed that the pandemic affected his film's rollout, Villeneuve became the most vocal opponent of Warner Brothers' decision to release Dune to the theaters and streaming simultaneously. He told Variety that AT&T, Warner Brothers' parent company, has hijacked one of the most respectable and important studio films in history. He accused them of having no love for cinema or the audience with their decision. As it would turn out, the simultaneous release on streaming would seem to have little effect on Dune Part 1. The movie would go on to make nearly $435 million worldwide, with a 2-hour and 35-minute runtime. With a budget of $165 million, a theatrical release of Dune was finally a success. And with an 83% certified fresh and a 90% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, it was agreed that the first half of the Dune epic was a visual masterpiece and a thrilling adaptation. Longtime fans felt they'd finally got a movie that both looked and sounded amazing, and they would be waiting on the edge of their seats for the sequel. Dune Part 1 was nominated for 10 Academy Awards. Dune Part 2 was officially greenlit at the end of October 2021, although Villeneuve had already been assured a couple weeks earlier that the sequel was 100% happening. One of the key points of negotiation before Part 2 was greenlit was assuring the sequel would have an exclusive window where it would only be shown theatrically, with Legendary and Warner Brothers eventually agreeing to give Dune Part 2 a 45-day window before it would be available through other channels. Villeneuve said this theatrical exclusion was a non-negotiable condition, and that the theatrical experience is at the very heart of cinematic language for him. In March 2022, Florence Pugh and Austin Butler were in talks to star in the film as Princess Irulan and Fade Routha. Butler, who had been impressive in the Elvis Presley biopic, was offered the role while having coffee with Villeneuve. No audition required. He trained for 4 months in Budapest using a fitness regime made by an ex-Navy SEAL member. Villeneuve described his performance as being a cross between an Olympic sword master, a snake, and Mick Jagger. His interpretation of the role was based off of Skarsgård's performance in 2021's Dune. When he first met Skarsgård, he spoke to him in his own voice. Skarsgård said he laughed so much because it was obvious Butler enjoyed being evil. In May 2022, Christopher Walken joined the cast as Emperor Shaddam IV. Production work for Part 2 had occurred back-to-back with the first film, but principal photography began in July 2022. Hans Zimmer also returned for Part 2, composing 90 minutes of music just to get Villeneuve inspired while writing. Dune Part 2 was originally scheduled to be released on October 20th, 2023, but was ultimately moved to March 1st, 2024 as a result of the writer's strike. As of the making of this video, advanced tickets for the film have surpassed Oppenheimer, and it's projected to gross around $170 million for its worldwide debut. Dune Part 2 is a huge success. One of the early fresh reviews says, "Now we know Frank Herbert's Dune can be filmed successfully." Another calls it a science fiction masterpiece. Once the dust settles, Dune Part 2 will exceed the international earnings of Part 1, making the 5-hour and 26-minute combined movie a billion-dollar franchise. With the success of Villeneuve's Dune, he's already started working on the sequel book, Dune Messiah. Although he is taking his time with it. He wants it to be the best movie possible. And while we are still currently waiting for Dune Messiah to be greenlit, the fact that Villeneuve says he's already nearly done with the script is a great sign we'll be seeing the studio backing soon. Dune has been widely influential, inspiring numerous novels, music, films, television, games, and comic books. It is considered one of the greatest and most influential science fiction novels of all time, with numerous modern science fiction works owing their existence to Dune. Dune has also been referenced in numerous other works including Star Trek, Chronicles of Riddick, The Kingkiller Chronicles, and Futurama. In 1977, David Matthews became one of the first artists to dedicate an entire composition to Dune, publishing an album of the same name on CTI Records. The heavy metal band Iron Maiden wrote the song To Tame a Land based on the Dune story. It appears as the closing track to their 1983 album, Peace of Mind. The original working title of the song was Dune. However, the band was denied permission to use it, with Frank Herbert's agent saying, Frank Herbert doesn't like rock bands, particularly heavy rock bands, and especially bands like Iron Maiden. Then in 1992 was Dune 2, which established the conventions of modern real-time strategy games and is considered to be among the most influential video games of all time. Rick Priestley cites Dune as a major influence on his 1987 wargame, Warhammer 40,000. In 2023, Funcom announced Dune Awakening, an upcoming massively multiplayer online game set in the universe of Dune. The game is scheduled for release sometime in 2024 and will be available on most gaming platforms. The Apollo 15 astronauts named a small crater on Earth's moon after the novel during the 1971 mission, and the name was formally adopted by the International Astronomical Union in 1973. Since 2009, the names of planets from the Dune novels have been adopted for the real-world nomenclature for planes and other features on Saturn's moon Titan, like Arrakis, Planitia. Even after nearly 60 years, it doesn't feel like the story on Dune is complete. Perhaps it never will be, but with a hope for future Dune movies and an upcoming massive online video game, it's clear that humanity continues to be compelled by the universe that Frank Herbert created. But what do you think? How do you feel about Herbert's novels? How do you feel about the on-screen adaptations that have followed, including the most recent movie? And what would you like to see happen in the future for the Dune franchise? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And also, don't forget to click on the link at the end of this video and check out this incredible Dune-inspired graphic design from the amazing artists at Mixtease.com. Get 20% off your purchase by using coupon code THEPOPCAST. The link is in the description below. Until next time,